NEMA is proud to present award-winning social commentator Carlo Rotella as the keynote speaker for its 92nd annual conference. I first encountered Carlo's work when I read his book, Good with Their Hands, an amazingly trenchant account of the people and culture of post-industrial American landscapes. Since then, we have all read and heard his work in many places: The New Yorker, New York Times, Boston Globe, and on WGBH. Carlo has the ability to weave a multiplicity of seemingly disconnected thoughts and characters into a cohesive cloth of great interest. Anyone who can combine the subjects of boxing and ballet in an intelligible essay is all right in my book. Carlo Rotella is director of the American Studies program, professor of English, and director of the Lowell Humanities series at Boston College. He's held Guggenheim, Howard, and Du Bois fellowships and received the Whiting Writers Award, the L.L. Winship Penn New England Award, and the American Scholars Prizes for Best Essay and Best Work by a Younger Writer. In addition to the newspaper and magazine work I just mentioned, he's the author of 3 books and countless scholarly articles. The San Francisco Chronicle said this about his work: Rotella combines a scholar's rigorous sense of the past with an urban journalist's street wisdom. The Chicago Tribune said, Carlo Rotella might or might not be good with his hands, are you? But to borrow Lyle Lovett's phrase, he has lights in his fingers. Rotella has written a well-crafted book, a meditation, really, on the fate of industrial culture in a post-industrial age. His topic today is the hook for the resell: creative individuals, cultural institutions, and the post-industrial city, which I'm sure will be both provocative and enjoyable. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carlo Rotella.
Thank you, Dan, and thanks for inviting me, and thanks to all of you. I'm a little out of my usual orbit at this event, so, and I hope that turns out to be a useful thing for you. I know it will be for me. So thanks for taking a chance on me. I will, am I on 2 microphones at the same time, or just one? I will not try to tell you how to run a museum or what the challenges facing you may be. You could do that way better than I could, and you're doing that here. So instead, I'm going to try to add to the conversation that you're having among yourselves as professionals by framing it with some relevant cultural history and by sketching out some models for understanding the relationship between an individual creative inspiration and the social conditions in which it takes shape. I'll try to put the challenges you face in your jobs in some kind of useful perspective by considering instances of the relationship between culture as artistic practice and as business, and the changing social landscape in which it takes tangible forms. Before I get to the concrete examples, I need to say a little more about, just to set up the terms and the title of the talk. That is creative individuals, cultural institutions, the post-industrial city, and that phrase, a hook for the resell. So let's start with just a sketch, a very brief sketch, of a model for what happens to the creative impulse. And I mean any creative impulse. I'm taking creativity to include art, but to extend well beyond it. Some people have a strong urge to make noise or music. Some people have a thing about line and color. Some people want to move their bodies in fresh and interesting ways that might qualify as art or as leisure or as sport. Right? Let's include it all under creativity. When you trace what happens to such impulses, you see a relatively inchoate urge take shape as it gets poured into the containers or the channels, each with its own distinctive shape, that are made available by a culture at any given moment. That's how the impulse, that original inchoate impulse, achieves form. Right? It takes the shape of the vessel into which it's poured. One category of container would be particular styles. For example, ways of playing the guitar, or ways of painting a landscape, or ways of dancing or fighting or cooking or making useful things. Institutions are another principal category of container. that gives form to creative impulses. That would include schools and also business enterprises, like music clubs and record labels and art galleries and publishing houses and boxing gyms. All sorts of institutions, large and small, in which a creative person may encounter the work of other practitioners, and may also encounter peers and mentors and apprentices and competitors. And institutions are also often the context in which a form of culture encounters audiences. And style and institutions work together. Certain institutions tend to house certain styles, which you can see, for instance, in the distinctive tone, right, and language of a particular magazine. There's a New Yorker way of writing. There's a Maxim way of writing. Right? Not that anybody reads Maxim here. Or in the tendency of a gallery or a record label to foster particular styles of playing or painting, or in a school's commitment to teaching certain ways of sculpting or writing or whatever it teaches. So it's an institution often that plays the key role in organizing the relationship between the original, relatively formless creative impulse and the way it takes tangible form in the world. What starts as maybe just an urge to make sound, right, eventually produces, through the encounter with styles and institutions and other sorts of containers, a definite musical form. And often a commodity, a song, a symphony, that an audience can consume and pay for. Now, I'm talking about artists, but I'm also talking about you. The impulse to collect and display things of artistic and historical significance is also a creative impulse. And as you're all intimately aware, you have to pour that impulse into the containers that the culture makes available to you at any given moment. That's what the museum is. Among other things, it's an extremely sophisticated container. The impulse is to gather and organize and display and preserve and educate and so on take definite form in institutions that have to meet demands on them as institutions. Raising money, recruiting audiences, paying employees, maintaining buildings, dealing with the state, so on. So all those business considerations help to define the shape of the container into which can be poured the creativity of the artists and others whose work and lives that you honor, but it's also the container into which your own professional creativity is poured, the creativity that's been shaped by your own individual encounters with styles and institutions. So I've been laying out a fairly abstract model of culture, and I'm done with that now. And I want to get more specific by narrowing down on how this process plays out in a particular kind of place that should be familiar to most everyone here, which is the post-industrial city. By which I mean a city that was once organized, and I mean organized physically, economically, socially, culturally, was once organized around the work of turning raw materials into finished goods in factories, and now no longer is. It doesn't mean the industrial city has disappeared. It means it's been layered under by other primary organizing functions, like providing services or handling information, that now play the dominant role in determining how life is lived in that place. You all know versions of the classic New England mill city, a city oriented to its rail lines and its working waterfront, with red brick factories and warehouses massed along them in neighborhoods of close-packed workers' housing and middle managers' housing, and then the mansions where the industrialists lived. This city was the central place of a region ordered around the task of getting ore or wood or grain or animal hides or some other extracted raw material into the machine-assisted hands of workers who came from far-flung hinterlands to do the labor of turning that raw material into finished goods to be recirculated to consumers. Everything about such a place was colored by its industrial form and function, and that includes its cultural institutions, library, art museum, college, ethnic associations, athletic leagues, museums, all shaped by the industrial process and the surplus capital that it generated. Especially in the Northeast, in the Midwest, in the second half of the 20th century, the industrial city gave way to a very different sort of city that grew up through and around it. A process of succession that's still ongoing and will never be completely done. Right? Post-industrial city may still have manufacturing concerns in it, but it's ordered around other primary functions like handling information and providing services. It's oriented to highways and surrounded by car-enabled suburban development, and its port has been supplanted by an airport, if it's big enough. The immigrants and migrants are coming from different hinterlands than before. The city's schools are more important than ever as places of intellectual credentialing and skill building for the job market. In big cities, there are clusters of steel and glass buildings and concentrations of universities and hospitals and other big research concerns. The industrial city's infrastructure, the factories and the housing and the riverfront and the rail network and so on, will have been variously repurposed or allowed to decay or torn down or renovated. And the cultural economy, including the work of providing meaningful experiences to visitors and residents, is an important element of this service and information city. The unfinished story of post-industrial transformation is not the only history that matters in such places, but it touches everything. This history is a main determining condition under which business is done, and it also increasingly serves as explicit subject and implicit subtext in the cultures of such places. So museums, for instance, that may have been created a century or more ago to carry people out and away from the gray, mechanized industrial city to take them to Renaissance Italy or to the pre-industrial New England of Indians and Pilgrims, are now increasingly about that very industrial period that they once sought to help citizens escape. That's the explicit story in all sorts of exhibitions, and it's implicit in the landscape and in the buildings. The industrial era isn't dead and it isn't gone. It continues to exert shaping force on the form and the function of post-industrial cities. For example, among the many ways to compare what's happened in post-industrial Lowell and post-industrial Brockton is to observe that the size and the vibration of textile-making machinery necessitated the building of big, solid plants in Lowell that survived handsomely to be repurposed into museums and cafes and condos, while the shoe industry, with smaller machines and much less vibration, could be housed in much slighter buildings in Brockton, often wood-frame buildings that haven't survived anywhere near as well. That's, of course, not the only difference between those cities, but it illustrates that even the most seemingly obsolete facts of industrial life may continue to influence what's possible in such places. So, with the model of culture and the historical frame in place, there's one last piece to assemble, and it's that phrase, a hook for the resale. It comes courtesy of a guy who people in your line of work might well regard as the competition, or even as a kind of culture business supervillain. His name's Warner Hedrick III, which is a good supervillain name. And I encountered him in Chicago 12 years ago when he was managing the House of Blues there. This was after he left the California Pizza Kitchen and before he went to the Hard Rock Casino in Las Vegas. We were talking about the business model at the House of Blues, and he said, blues by itself doesn't pay the bills, but blues is a hook for the resale. He meant a couple of different things by this. First, he meant that he couldn't run a major venue on the revenue that blues music itself brings in. Instead, he programmed all kinds of music on the main stage, and he consigned actual live blues to the smaller restaurant stage downstairs. But the House of Blues still foregrounded blues as a cultural tradition in its self-presentation, in its decor, in its name, in its corporate rhetoric. The idea was that blues is roots music, and roots music is the foundation of currently more popular genres, and therefore blues is the House of Blues brand's guarantor of authenticity and soulfulness, right? A hook for the resale of classic rock and hip-hop and metal and electronica and all the other more popular genres that drew the requisite numbers. Second, he meant that music, blues or any other kind of music, wasn't the direct source of profit. Music was a hook to get 10,000 to 15,000 people a week through the doors of the House of Blues in order to buy things to eat and drink and wear, which generated the profit. Hedrick said, we have auxiliary venues in the building that service the guests, same as in a hotel, where the rooms division brings in the folks, and the restaurant and room service provide the resale. So Hedrick is my theorist. He's my honorary Frenchman, right, for this talk, because the model of a hook for the resale is one key to understanding how forms of culture can be situated to finesse city-shaping flows of capital and power and people and ideas. A hook for the resale captures one common situation in the culture business, especially those parts of it that are most attuned to the past or to the public good or to art for art's sake. That is, a situation of being obliged to attend to the bottom line, but screened by a judiciously employed private capital or public power from having to answer only to the bottom line. He was saying that the only way for the House of Blues to do anything at all to sustain the blues tradition, even just as a usable past, was to set up the blues in just such a partially screened situation. That involved a lot of compromises, some distasteful, like reducing live blues to music to ignore, right, while you do lunch. But the alternative was to jettison that tradition entirely. And the House of Blues felt that it was both good for the world and good for the brand to keep blues around in some form as a hook for the resale, contributing to the bottom line, but not asked to carry the main load. Such compromises, even at their grimmest, right, can be instructive. A hook for the resale can describe theme park atrocities, and there's no question about that. But it can also describe something more artistically viable and even sometimes vibrant. I'm going to look at some examples of post-industrial situations in which a creative impulse expressed in particular styles and housed in particular institutions has produced a form that can serve as a hook for the resale. The art and the associated sense of the past is not nakedly exposed to bottom line considerations, but attends to them from behind a shelter provided by private capital or the state or both. So let's stay in Chicago. I'll come back to New England for the others, but let's stay in Chicago to consider a first example. In a second, I want you to watch a clip from a documentary that was shot in the early 1990s that features Buddy Guy. Buddy Guy is the leading practitioner of blues Chicago style. He inherited that title when Muddy Waters died. He's playing a song called 5 Long Years in this clip, which is a post-war standard about a guy who works in a steel mill.